Hi everyone and welcome. Today I will be recommending 10 fantasy standalones that I think you should give a try. Now I've said this before, but I do think that fantasy enthusiasts like series, most of all because we want to be connected to these characters, we want to get lost in this world for a long period of time. However, I do think that fantasy standalones can be great palate cleansers to read in between these big fantasy series, when you're not ready for the next installment just yet, but you also don't want to start yet another series. Fantasy standalones are perfect for those moments, and I think that these 10 are some that might be perfect for you as well. Now, the first two that I have to talk about are actually written by the same author, Neil Gaiman. The first one is Stardust, and then the other one is The Ocean at the End of the Lane. Now, Stardust is definitely more the traditional portal fantasy of the two, in which we meet a young man who lives somewhere in England, and one night when he's with the girl that he loves, they see a fallen star. Now, the girl makes him a promise that if he goes and retrieves that fallen star, she will marry him. Now, of course, he embarks on an adventure. To retrieve that fallen star, he needs to cross a magical border, get inside a magical land, and there he meets pirates with flying ships, witches, and much more. Now, I think that of this one, I liked the message most of all, the learning curve that you see this man go through, and I really enjoyed that. It is a very short book, but it's great to just pick up and read in a weekend, which is actually exactly what I did for this one. But of the two, I actually like The Ocean at the End of the Lane more because it's more unique. It's not your typical fantasy, it's almost real life, but with some strange elements added to it. In this one, we meet a man of middle age, and he just attended a funeral. He's driving around mindlessly. He doesn't really know if he has a destination in mind, but all of a sudden he finds himself back in his old neighborhood from when he was a child. More specifically, he finds himself at the end of the lane where his neighborhood friend used to live. And he just sits down at that pond. He doesn't really know a lot, but once he goes, sits down and thinks, all the memories come flooding in. One of them is that this pond they used to call an ocean, hence the ocean at the end of the lane. And he starts thinking about his childhood and what happened. And is this actually true, or are there some elements that are a little bit fantasy or magical in nature? I think that here we also have quite a couple of important themes of childhood trauma, as well as abuse even. And I think that the ending of this one is what made it maybe one of my all-time favorite standalones for a very short book. I think that Neil Gaiman for these two has beautiful writing style, but with this one the message was what really struck me. So yes, two short fantasy standalones that I can highly recommend. Now, most people know that I adore myth retellings, and Daughters of Sparta is no exception. This book is written by Clay Haywood, and of course this is a Greek myth retelling in which we follow two princesses of Sparta, the sisters Clytemnestra and Helen. Now, most people know Helen as Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world, and when we talk about Helen, we talk of her in the idea of Troy. That is the setting that we picture her in. And most of the time, when this story is retold, we think of the Trojan War, we think of Achilles, but here we actually go back. We go back to when these two sisters were young, we follow them through childhood, young adulthood, when they have to marry, and how the Trojan War plays into it is more of a background thought, and we go toward that event, but everything that happens beforehand. I loved the two POVs of these sisters, and I have seen some mixed reviews, which were most of the time, we don't really see a lot of the Trojan War, which for me is a plus, because that's why we have these two POVs, because they're different from what we've seen before. There are a lot of books about the Trojan War. If you want to read about that, you can find that, but this is different. And other people also said that the events here were not depicted as it is in the original myth, but again, that's what I liked here. These two women are kept in the dark for a lot of time, so sometimes they might have an idea about what's happening that's not exactly true, and I love the narration here and how it is really colored through the glasses of the POVs that we have. So one that I would highly recommend, especially if you do like these myth retellings through the lenses of characters, often women, that we don't really see a lot of in the original myths or in myth retellings before this period. Now we have a lot of women-centered myth retellings, and this is definitely one of those. So one that I highly recommend, especially if you do like Greek myth retellings and if you've seen enough of the same old story being told over and over again. Last year I tried my first Guy Gabriel Kay novel, which was A Brightness Long Ago, and I really adored it. This is a standalone, so you can just read this book and be done with Guy Gabriel Kay, but if you like this one as much as I did, I think that you will try other of his works as well. This is a fantasy work, but it's extremely low in the fantastical elements. It takes place in a secondary world, but in a time and place that is very reminiscent of Renaissance Italy. And at the start, we actually meet an old man who is going to tell you his life story. Now, if you know me, that's something that I absolutely adore as a narrative device, and it worked very well here as well. So Daniel, who the young man is, who's telling you his life story, was actually a nobody. But through a leap of fate, he gets involved in the political battle almost of two mercenary soldiers or captains. They have very important families behind them, and you can really see that these are gentlemen, but make no mistake, they are deadly. I really enjoyed reading about these characters. I liked the idea of the butterfly effect, which is very prominent in this novel, and I think if you are a character-driven reader who likes Robin Hobb's works, you will like this one as well. I also absolutely adore the writing style. Guy Gavrilke in this one uses more words than he needs, but he does it to go towards a prose that I just really enjoy. So definitely give this one a try if it sounds interesting to you. If you don't know a lot about Renaissance Italy, I didn't, and it doesn't really have an impact. I actually have a spoiler-free review for this one, and Robin Hobb has written a spoiler-free review on Goodreads for this one, and I think that that's really spot on. So definitely read that one as well if you want to know more about this book. The next novel that I want to recommend is Cunning Women by Elizabeth Lee. Now, this is one of those standalones that get tagged on Goodreads as historical fiction and as fantasy. You could read it either way. I decided to read it as a fantasy novel, and it worked that way for me. But I think that it's safe to say that the fantastical elements are extremely minimal, and if you expect an epic fantasy, that's not what you're going to get here. It's actually very slow, and some might even say boring book. But if those buzzwords make you excited, please give it a try. This book takes place in 17th century England. We meet Sarah, who is a teenager, and she is seen as a cunning woman. Now, of course, cunning women or witches get shunned, and she actually lives at the edge of the village together with her mother, who believes that she is a witch, her brother, and her young sister. Her mother tells her that she is also marked by the devil, so she will become a witch eventually. And of course, this is a life of loneliness, and one of the POVs that we do follow is Sarah. Another POV is the son of a farmer, and again, by chance, these two lives get entwined, and I just really liked seeing how their perspectives change as the story progresses and as they get more information about each other. The ending is what, again, solidified it for me as a book that I just thoroughly enjoyed and think about time and time again. Even though it has been almost a year since I read it, it was bittersweet, but it was so amazing and fitting for the story that I just think anybody who likes these kind of boring developing books, like The Binding. The Binding is my favorite standalone of all time. If you like that one, I think you might enjoy this one as well. Next up, I have another atypical fantasy recommendation, and that is A Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires by Grady Hendrix. Now, this is horror, but it's also funny. There's a lot of comedy here, which definitely brings down the tension, which is why I would just recommend it to everybody, basically, even if you don't like horror novels. This one takes place in the 80s and 90s in an American suburb, and we meet a couple of housewives. They come together for a book club every week or every month and just talk to each other. Now, one day, one of these housewives gets a new neighbor, and there's just something off about this neighbor, and she goes to investigate. Now, I think that just that in itself is a very engaging plot, and I loved that plot, and just trying to discover what happened there exactly and the tension that you do have sometimes when they go out and investigate. However, something that Grady Hendrix added to the story and that I could really appreciate was an added layer almost. Because in this landscape, in the 90s, being a housewife, a lot of people looked down upon these women, and when they had valid complaints, oftentimes even their husbands would say, well, you have a lot of time on your hands, are you sure you're not imagining things? And I think that showed that the true horror of this book is maybe not the monster, but other things as well. And I think that Grady Hendrix did an amazing job. So if you are looking for a book to read around October, if you're a scaredy cat and you don't want to go into real horror, then this is perfect, especially if you listen to the audiobook, because I thought that the accent of the narrator was spot on and it really brought the story to life. So another one that is maybe a little bit atypical, but I can highly recommend. Now, of course, I also had to recommend some fairy tales. I have a classic and a modern fairy tale. The first one that I have here is The Last Unicorn by Peter S. Beagle, of course, a classic. I watched the movie as a child, and it was my favorite movie. I watched it maybe over 50 times because every time that we went and rented a movie, I wanted to have this one. It took me quite a long time. I think that only a couple of years ago I realized that this was based upon a book. So of course I had to read it, and I was very relieved to see that the original source material was as good, if not better, than the movie. So I highly recommend this book, but also the movie, and maybe do both. If you can, if you do have the time, both of them are masterpieces. Now in this one, of course, we have a unicorn. She lives in the forest, she doesn't really have a care in the world, which is very typical for unicorns, until one day she encounters two hunters. Now they don't see her, but she does hear them say, that unicorns are just no longer of this world. They will never encounter a unicorn because there are no unicorns left. First, she scoffs at that idea, but after she thinks about it, it really leaves her with a burning question. Is she the last of her kind? So she embarks on a quest to see if there are other unicorns, or if not, what happened to her kind. This is a beautiful story, and I think that Peter S. Beagle also has beautiful writing style that fits itself very well for fairy tales. Now then, for an original modern fairy tale, we have A Pocket Full of Crows, which is a beautiful title, and it does really show the prose that you will find in this book. This is written by Joanne M. Harris, who has written other modern fairy tales, but this is the first one by her that I have tried. Now, the more classic fairy tale talks about the prince and the princess, they meet each other and then they have a happily ever after, the end. This one goes further. This is a story of betrayal and revenge. Here you have a wild girl who lives in the forest and she meets her prince, and she tries to change herself for this prince. But, like I said, the story does not go as how you would expect it to go. Love made her a prisoner, revenge will set her free. A modern fairy tale of love, loss, and revenge. This is a perfect modern classic. This book is divided into months, and at the start of each month you also have a beautiful poem. So yes, another one that I think if you like fairy tales, if you're looking for something different than what you see in the classics, this is one that you definitely need to give a try. Now, for all the standalones so far, I mentioned how they are the perfect snack to read in between these big installments of very long series. However, I do think that the next one that I'm going to talk about deserves your undivided attention, and to be honest, it needs your undivided attention. And that is The Spear Cuts Through Water by Simon Geminis. Now, this is such a unique fantasy book that while reading, I thought this is not going to be for everybody. It's going to be a very acquired taste. However, so far, every time that I talked about this book to somebody who has read it, they absolutely adored it. So one that you should definitely try out to see if it's something for you. Apparently, it is something for most people, and it's something extraordinary. In this one, we have a story within a story within a story. Now that sounds very confusing, but just let me talk you through it. We meet a character who lives in present day, it seems, and they talk to their grandmother, who still remembers the old country, or at least what she was told about the old country. So she often tells this story to this character. Now one day this character goes to sleep and they dream about this theater, where a myth of the old country is being played out. And then we have the meat of this entire book, which is that myth. In the old country, there was an emperor who really was a tyrant. He had godlike powers, and his 3 sons, the 3 terrors, if that tells you something, also have these godlike powers. They have these powers because they have imprisoned a goddess. Now one day this goddess escapes, and we follow these 2 young men who, by fate, accompany this goddess. This takes place over 5 days, and the book is also divided in these 5 days. I love this. It was almost a modern myth that I was reading, and it felt like I was not really connected to the characters because you have this big epic myth and the characters almost don't feel like characters or like real people. But then there are these very intimate moments as well, and they hit you very hard. I've cried a couple of times during reading this book. It took me a while because before I was very invested, but then once I couldn't put it down. So this is one that I think you should give a try. It's really a modern fantasy book that does something different. And I will definitely be trying more by Simon Geminis. I know that he has written a sci-fi standalone, which is very different, I've heard. But if he dabbles in fantasy again, I will definitely pick that one up. And then of course I have the complete opposite, a very quick snack, something that does nothing very extraordinary, but what it does, making you feel good, it does so perfectly. And that is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sanghu Mandana. Now this is a fantasy romance. Are you going to be surprised multiple times while reading this book? No, but it also doesn't try to be that. And that's why it's so much fun. In this one, which takes place in present time, we meet a witch. She has a very bubbly personality, but she's actually very lonely because she cannot be herself to anybody. One day she receives an email that a witch is wanted in this very big estate because there are 3 small witches who have no control over their powers. And their guardians, they don't have power, so they cannot help them. This witch decides to go and help them, and of course one of these guardians is a very brooding individual who has trauma of his own. And we all know how this is going to end, but because it's so feel good, I think that this is perfect if you're down and if you just want to have a book with low stakes. The world is not going to catch fire if our main character don't do A, B, C. It's just fun. Pick this one up if that's what you need. So those were the 10 fantasy standalones that I wanted to recommend to you. As always, if I have talked about these books in a spoiler-free review or in another recommendations video, I have linked all of those in the description box down below. If there is a fancy standalone that you want to recommend to me, definitely do so. And if you want to see another recommendations video, which would be part 4, also let me know, because at this point in time I have 10 other ones that I could already talk about, since it has been a while since I recommended standalones. Also, if you don't have enough by these 10 and you want to have some more, definitely check out the previous part, which you can find right here. As always, I hope that you enjoyed this video and see you next time. Bye!